Dr. George Friedman is our next speaker. He's the CEO of Stratfor, a global intelligence company that he founded in 1996. He's a distinguished author of several books on national security and on intelligence. His latest book, entitled The Next Decade, debuted at number 3 on the New York Times bestseller list. In his book, he focuses on geopolitical forecasting skills on the next 10 years and the major events and challenges that will face this country and face the president in office. Dr. Friedman has been featured in many publications, including Time Magazine. He's been on the cover of Barron's, he's been in the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, and the New York Times. Dr. Friedman graduated with a bachelor's degree from the City College of New York and has a PhD in government from Cornell University. Sometimes controversial, always insightful. Please welcome Dr. George Friedman.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here because I don't have to be studying the head of the IMF. We live in a time when a Frenchman gets arrested for attempted rape and the French are insulted. So let's leave that world behind and let's focus in on technology, which is an essential part of geopolitics. It's an essential part of geopolitics because you, as an industry, exist and are shaped, are created by geopolitics. You may not realize it, but everything from funding to government policy to the requirements of the world turn around that. In the 19th century, the major issue was globalization. No New York Times, globalization did not happen 11 years ago. It happened in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, stole all the gold in South America, and financed the rise of the Habsburg Empire. Cutting out a lot of intermediate steps here. In the 19th century, the British reached the mature state of an empire. It was global, it was economically integrated, and it desperately needed some technologies to make it work. And there were 3 sets of technologies. The first was global communication. The telegraph, the wireless, Twitter, all are an ongoing pattern of development that begins in the 19th century and is driven not because entrepreneurs had a wonderful idea, but because you could not run the British Empire, or the French Empire, the Belgian Empire, unless you could speak to the people in the field. And the funding for this came from governments. They're the ones who underwrote global communications. And the second thing you had to have was global transportation. You couldn't have an empire that it took you 6 months to reach some part of. And so that led away from the age of sail to coal. That led away from coal, which was very difficult to carry, to oil. That led to the oil industry here in Texas and everywhere else. That led to automobiles. That led to the entire structure of transportation that drives the world today. But the aircraft was not developed by entrepreneurs. It was developed by the government funding entrepreneurs, who then later announced a business model for making money from it. It was called World War II and sold it to the government. Because one of the things that you also had to do if you were going to have a global system is finance and structure global war. Because where human beings go, wars go. The United States spent 17% of the 20th century in a state of high-intensity warfare. It spent almost 100% of the 21st century in the same condition. There is a reason why so much of the high-tech industry develops not just out of DARPA, but out of everything else. The microchip, the science behind it existed all the time, but ICBMs needed onboard computers that were lightweight and could withstand a boost, and vacuum tubes couldn't do that. So it was the ICBM that makes the microchip possible, funds it, that diffuses to the civilian space program, and eventually winds in an iPad that I've been told by my staff has changed the world. Nothing will ever again be the same. I think ICBMs are more important. But they tell you that. But it's important to look at an iPad, because an iPad is the latest frenzy. It is a laptop computer without a keyboard, but it does have a touchscreen. It's very nice. But there's no new technology in it. It has a new business model attached to it, where they're trying to attach more business models to it. But it is mature technology. The basic principles, the microchip, the basic concept of the software driving it, these have been here for a while. They're refined, and there's endless refinement. We are nearing the end of what I'll call the European imperialist phase of technology, which begins with the telegraph, begins with the steamship, begins with warships able to go long distances, and culminates at the extreme moment of global communication, which is Twitter. With Twitter, anyone can say anything to everyone at any given time. That's nice, assuming anyone has anything to say. At this point, the pipe probably is larger than the quality of information to be transferred. In the 1950s, automobiles were considered high-tech. Being an automotive engineer, or being a radio engineer, television engineer, puts you on the cutting edge, and it was. But even by the 1950s, there was more changes in design taking place than in the fundamentals of automotive engineering. There were refinements, but by the 1930s, you had the basic car. And of course, the most important thing that happened with the automobile was the business model, which was the dealership, where you could buy it, get it serviced, value added. And in the 1950s, you look at the car, and who was in charge of it? It was the designers, who were making the important decisions on whether to have split seats or bench seats, mud flaps, tails, all those things. You were at the point where automotive engineering had reached the limits of what that paradigm could support. There was very little to add to it. And it was in the hands of the designers who competed for market share based on refinements and appearance. That was not the high point of the auto industry. It was the death knell. There's always high tech, is what I'm saying. But very frequently, last generation's exciting innovation in the hands of designers and marketing people appear to be high tech. So you probably didn't want to make major investments in new auto companies in the 1950s. And the microchip now is, believe it or not, 40 years old or so. It has evolved and done many vital things. The Defense Department gave us the internet so they can move data around in large amounts. The intimate relationship between geopolitics, war, and technology is still in place. From Oracle, the US Navy, and databases, to LexisNexis and the CIA, who funded their beginning, and the legal profession. We in the United States have an extraordinary record of technical innovation. And the division of labor is the universities create the science, the Defense Department creates the first applications at tremendous cost, and entrepreneurs bring this into the consumer market. So the question is, what comes next? And as everything else, it will build on what went before, but it'll be different. And if the foundation of the 19th century was the globalization of the British Empire, and everything was somehow built to tie that together, what is it that makes us, what is now happening geopolitically? And the answer to that, in a way, is simple, self-evident, and ignored. The single most important thing taking place today is everywhere in the world, the birth rate per woman is declining. There is nowhere in the world where it's rising. Women are having fewer babies everywhere. In the advanced industrial world, the reproductive rate has fallen between 2.1 women baby per woman. 2.1 is the number you need to have to maintain. Germany will have a 30% decline in population within the next 20 to 30 years. Most of Europe, not all of Europe, but most of Europe will. The non-immigrant section of the American population will also have a massive decline. It will be made up for by the fact that we're very good at handling immigration. But something extraordinary is happening that has not happened in 500 years. 500 years ago, the world's population began to rise. It reached its peak rise in the 20th century when the population of the world quadrupled. In the next 50 years, the population of the world will increase by about 50%. By the end of the century, it will stop increasing worldwide. But that means it'll stop increasing in Bangladesh. It'll long ago have been in decline in the advanced industrial world. In the middle tier, Mexico, Turkey, places like this, will be the same decline in the next 50 years. Why? Well, when our great-grandparents lived, having children was their Social Security. You had children, you had someone to take care of you when you were old. Your children, your host. So in order for a woman to have 2 children, she had to have 8. 4 would die before the first year. 2 of the remaining will die before puberty. 8 children made a stable population. This started to go away at the beginning of the 20th century, of the 19th century. And the population started surging, and along with it, life expectancy increased. The reason for this is very simple. In rural society, having a bunch of children, 8 children now survive, is really good. They take care of you, they go farm, whatever they do. Having 8 children in urban industrial society is suicidal. Because having 8 children is something you cannot economically support, makes no sense, and therefore we don't have it. In the past 20 years, women have gone to having their first child at the average age of 23 in the United States to 31. That is a massive shift in how we live. It also means that, for example, for women who spend most of their lives reproducing in previous societies, if they have 2 children, return to the workforce after the second one's in school, she'll spend about 8 years out of the workforce, live for 80 years, 90% of her life will not be spent nurturing, which also means the structure of marriage changes. But the most important thing that changes is we have lived in a world where there have always been more consumers, more producers, more everything. Not going to be the way it is. It's not a prediction. I mean, this is arithmetic. You take a look at the birth rate now, you project forward, you know it can't, and it's not going to change. Because having a child, the average child today, lives, stays in work, stays in school until about the age of 22, 23 in the OECD countries, the advanced countries. He retires at 65, lives to 80. Half of his life is spent outside of the workforce. When we invented Social Security, we made 65 the retirement age. Life expectancy of the average male was 63 years. He wasn't expected to live to 80. There was no way in the system that people would leave the workforce and not work for 15 years and consume, plus go to school till their early 20s. It is an economically unsupportable model. And as for me, I mean, I had a kid who went to WashU. WashU owns me. Imagine having 5 of them. 10, 15, absurd. We will not go back to a period where we have more children. We can't afford it. For those of us who need the emotional pleasure of having children, we are discovering that one will do very nicely. Two is probably excessive. So this is the problem that we face. And it's partly a social problem, and it's partly an economic problem. And the economic problem consists basically of this. You can't cut back education because the technology you need requires a level of sophistication, and social structure is so complex. You don't kind of, at the age of 7, leave and go, run a marketing firm. I know some people who did, but usually don't do that. The real problem, the real challenge we face is the period between the age of 65 and 80, and the crisis of degenerative disease. It's not a problem people die at 65 from a social standpoint. It's not a problem they live till 80 and work. It is a huge problem if they retire at 65, get Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, cancer, and so on, become mass consumers of health care, and there's no one to take care of them. What do we do? I mean, one option is put them in ice flow and let them go out. My kids have said they're going to do that to me. But they're sentimentalists. What do we do under these circumstances? This is the crisis facing us. It faces us in the daily political debates, which are mostly incoherent. But the debate about Medicare is about this issue. The debate about the price of schooling is about this issue. Everything we're discussing is about this issue. And the slogans aren't going to solve it, obviously. It's always technology. So the technology that's high-tech now are the ones that address this issue. The ones that address the issue of nuclear missiles are no longer high-tech. That has now settled down to an iPad. We are now facing fundamental problems that technology has to address, and that's what high-tech is. And there are 3 areas that clearly have to be addressed. The first is biomedical. Degenerative diseases are no longer an inconvenience to the family. They represent a fundamental threat to the viability of the society. With the number of people facing degenerative diseases over the next 15 years, the social cost will make investment capital non-existent. If you take the cost of Medicare over the next 15 years and take a look at the investment pool, you can have one, you can have the other. You're not going to have both. So, what is it that is necessary to do, and therefore will be done? An attack on degenerative diseases. Biomedical research into a small class of diseases that have a high impact on our society is clearly essential. The funding will, of course, come from the government. The good ideas will come from the universities, and the money will be made by the marketing departments of biomedical companies. That's the way life works. That's America. The second thing that we have to have is we have a declining labor pool. We have the option of experiencing a declining standard of living or dramatically increasing productivity. The silicon chip has run its course. It can't do a lot more. It doesn't have the computing power. You can gang it 47 different ways to hell. You're at the limit. But what we clearly need are robotics. And by that, I don't necessarily mean, a mechanical guy walking around and stuff, although that'd be very cool. What I mean is systems that can replace labor. Because don't think in 50 years you're going to have Mexican immigrants. Mexico is a booming country, it's a $1 trillion country, and the opportunities there are soon going to outstrip the possibility of changing your sheets in a nursing home here. How do we do that? We need a range of applications that can take over as much of the labor force as possible so that productivity growth can continue. In my view, the silicon chip can't possibly support this. There has to be a dramatic new shift in computing. Everybody says that's in neural net computing, therefore I will, without any knowledge, announce that's not it. Anytime in the early stage of computing when everybody knows what the solution is, it'll come from somewhere else. I don't know what the solution is. I strongly suspect it is in material science, in developing processing media that are radically different than what silicon gives us. And also computer languages that aren't binary. Binary languages are slow. That's fine for word processing or listening to your latest tune on your iPad. But to make complex decisions or pseudo-decisions is something that's going to be supported by some sort of biologic material or some materials we don't know. But the binary logic that we have built, the computing industry, doesn't map to robotics. It simply has too finite a series of choices, too linear logic, and so on. I know nothing about this, which qualifies me to discuss it endlessly. But it's in the history of technology, which I do know something about, is you reach a limit to what you can do with something. And you have a new problem. And you build from the previous paradigm, this is what I know about computing, and you create new possibilities. In the same way the steamship went from coal to oil. Tremendous difference, but still within the same paradigm. And that's where we're facing. We are looking at new technologies. The third element to say is, if you're looking for new technologies in robotics, energy consumption is going to soar. The idea that we are going to cut consumption of energy is a fantasy. If you ride your bicycle to work, you can feel virtuous. I certainly respect you for your commitment, but it isn't going to make any difference. The reason is that we are going to be having large populations that require massive support, and as soon as you take a machine and make it do things, like an automobile, its consumption is going to go right through the roof. And therefore, we need a dramatically reduced cost of energy. The problem, I don't get into a religious argument, so I don't know if there's social warming or not. And it's ceased to be a rational discussion, so I can't have it. We know this debate's over. Okay, but we do know this much. Consumption controls will lead to a massive collapse in standards of living. And that is not going to happen politically. There's no way you can politically tell this generation you're going to have a 30% decline in your standard of living for your grandchildren. It's not the way it works. What is needed is an economic solution that does something extraordinary. Not cut consumption, but cut the cost of energy dramatically. With cheap energy, you can do a lot of things. For example, you can solve your water problems. We have a water shortage. Actually, we don't have a water shortage. Our problem is our water is mixed with salt. We have lots of water. You just can't drink it. The desalinization process is well known, as is the transport of water. It just is a hog of energy. If your energy costs are going to soar to $300 a barrel equivalent, you can't solve your water problem. So the question then becomes, how do you reduce the cost of energy? And there you have to have a paradigm shift away from the hydrocarbon economy to something else. The most likely solution is, of course, solar energy. The problem, however, in the face of the Earth is three things: clouds, seasons, and night. That plus the fact that you'd have to cover much of the southeast of the United States to generate the energy needed, even at a higher level, which I don't mind, except it would cost me Las Vegas, and that I do mind. Quite seriously, solar on the face of the Earth creates, like wind power, extraordinarily unexpected ecological effects. Mitsubishi has invested $21 billion. Airbus has invested it. We're about to get a major study out of the federal government on space-based solar. Space-based solar is not a scientific breakthrough. We know how to construct large structures in space. There is no clouds in space. There is no night and day. And there are two separate ways to transmit the power back to Earth, which will undoubtedly cause problems, but everything causes problems. Space-based solar energy represents a way to dramatically reduce the price of energy. So right now, we are struggling to maintain our energy consumption in the face of rising prices. On the other side of the graph, you have rising demand that can't be controlled because it's demographically rooted. These two lines cannot survive. We also have technology for which science is well known. And what we need is low-cost lift. Now, out in the Western Desert, Bezos and others are building rockets, and they say it's for tourism. Yeah. Whoever wins the lift game and reduces the cost of lift will have the power to control energy. The biggest limit to our ability to construct in space is how much it costs per pound